Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the National Foundation of Swallowing Disorders SoundByte podcast, raising awareness of the impact and prevalence of swallowing disorders across the age span. My name is Elizabeth Daly, and today we're joined by Rebecca, a mother whose 3-year-old son has battled mysterious blue spells and choking episodes since birth, requiring multiple hospitalizations. Rebecca, thank you for joining us today. Could you start by sharing with us the journey that you've been on with your son from his birth to finally receiving a diagnosis and treatment for his difficulty with swallowing?
Yeah, thank you for having me today. So it might sound funny when I say that it's taken a long time to arrive at a diagnosis, even though my son is only 3. But the past 3 years, he's now 3.5, have definitely been filled with a lot of questions and things not adding up. So my son's journey really began, I would say, in the delivery room. He was born, but he didn't cry at birth. He presented as just weak overall, but because he was born at the peak of COVID, they were understaffed and they kept him for just one day because if a child didn't present as a very obvious risk, there was no need to keep them in the hospital for a long time. When he came home, my husband noticed that he had pyroric cyanosis. He was blue around the lips. We called our pediatrician. Ultimately, we were sent back to the hospital, to a different hospital with a much higher level pediatric department. And there he kept having these mysterious moments of not breathing. They ran what they called the $1 million testing. Like they did every type of test that they could do. At first, they thought he might, God forbid, have like a heart condition or something else that would cause not breathing or lack of saturation of oxygen. There were a lot of different things that didn't add up, and thank God all the tests came back negative, which was obviously extremely reassuring, but also not, because without a reason, how did I know that it wasn't going to happen again? Mm-hmm. Because they happened so frequently, they kept him in the NICU for about 2 weeks until he was 1 week apnea free. In the hospital, because it was Corona, the rules were very restrictive, and I was only allowed to visit him for about an hour a day. So in that hour, I would try to nurse him, try to hold him, try to bond with him. And every time that I would try to nurse him, he would gag and he would need nasal cannula. And so finally, slowly these things improved. He was on a lower dose of oxygen, and then eventually he didn't need the oxygen anymore. They had called in feeding to examine him, and they red flagged him, but then he kind of improved. His condition was a little bit inconsistent. Sometimes he choked, sometimes he didn't choke. So, and I think ultimately they wanted him out of there as soon as possible for obvious reasons. So he came home, and he was and ultimately the diagnosis that we'd been given was that even though he was born full term, sometimes full term babies act like preemies and have immature nervous systems and can't regulate their breathing. Now, to this day, I don't know if that was the correct diagnosis, or if what I'm thinking now that I have more knowledge is that really it was a combination of that plus the congenital defect, which caused his swallowing issue, which was discovered much, much later. Mm-hmm. But when he came home, I tried to make up for lost time, and really I was extremely dedicated to nursing him. He's my 3rd child, but he's the first that I would say militantly nursed. I gave no bottles, no pacifiers. And I noticed he couldn't keep a pacifier in his mouth. And when he would nurse, he would often cough, and he would as if someone was swallowing the wrong way. Mm-hmm. He'd cough it out and we'd move on. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned it to the doctor, but it was not something that was, after all that he had been through, because he had had such an extensive workup, and because nothing had come out. The results were, I wouldn't say inconclusive. They showed that nothing was wrong with him. Mm-hmm. No one thought necessarily to send him for a modified barium swallow study. And I tried very hard not to view him as a sick child after all that he had been through. I didn't want to treat him like he was sick. He was out of the hospital. He deserved to not be overly coddled. And that was very, very hard for me, and remains hard for me to this day, because the choking incidents, they would disappear and then they'd reappear. And when they would reappear with a vengeance. So their was a time actually where we lived in an apartment until he was about 2 years old. About a week after moving into our house, he had a few times in a row these episodes where he wasn't like active, like he wasn't like exercising or playing. He was just sitting on the couch. He wasn't eating. And he would just start like coughing. And one might think that if someone's coughing, could be like a result of like excessive exercise, like playing tag, or that they're choking from eating. But he wasn't. And he wasn't eating, and he wasn't running, and he just started coughing, and he couldn't catch his breath. We thought that he was choking. We didn't know on what, but he was little, so it's possible that he had like put something in his mouth. But something didn't make sense. We called an ambulance, and by the time they came, he was all better. This then happened 2 days later, and we called the pediatrician, and they put him on a nebulizer. They said he must have like croup. Ultimately, that set forth a bigger red flag, which made me pursue a diagnosis.
Wow. That's a lot to go through, and that has to be scary, as a mother, especially you had just given birth. To see your child turning blue is such a terrifying thing to do. I have a 6-month-old son almost right now, and he had RSV at 6 weeks, and he turned blue, and it's the scariest thing. And you feel so helpless as a parent, not knowing what to do. What's the right thing? How do I help in this situation?
So scary, especially when you're not in a hospital setting and there's technically like no reason for it. Mm-hmm. Because there's no reason, there's nothing you can do. If a child has asthma, then he usually has, let's say, an emergency inhaler. Mm-hmm. If a child has whatever it is, you avoid the conditions that would bring on the breathing challenges. But here, they were seemingly brought on by nothing. Yeah. And so there was nothing that I could do, so I could never let down my guard.
Yeah. Oh, that's so scary. I guess I'm going to skip ahead to a question here. How have you coped with that, and how are you dealing with all of that trauma?
So it's interesting. I feel that he has changed the dynamic of our household. And unfortunately, like while he's brought a lot of light and joy into our home, he's also, I feel bad saying that he's brought a lot of tension, but he's definitely brought a heightened level of anxiety, which I think is typical when a person has a child who has other needs, extra needs, special needs, whatever you want to call it, depending on the degree. He recently had surgery about 3 months ago to correct what was ultimately found that was causing the defect. He's still not completely better, although he's much, much better. And still, I feel a tremendous relief now because I know that there was a reason. So I have something to hold on to, and that reason was corrected. But still, I keep a much closer... I keep a close eye on all of my children, as every mother should, but I keep an extra close eye. Like, I don't close the door. I'm always listening to hear if they're coughing or if there's choking. So I really still have a hard time not letting my guard down, and it's something that I'm very conscious of in terms of... I don't want him to feel like I'm being a helicopter mom, and I want to be the proper balance,
right?
Between protective but not overprotective, which is extremely challenging when you know that unexpectedly so many times you had to call an ambulance. Right. So it's not easy. It's something that I'm very conscious of that I try to work on.
Yes, yeah, that's such a hard thing to do to. Try to balance that when you want to just be there for every moment, just in case. Yep, but still let him live a full life. Oof. Can you tell us a little bit more about what type of surgery he had?
So, before I tell you about the surgery, I'll share how we got to the surgery. Yeah. So, I shared that we moved into a house when he was about 2 years old. Around that time, about 2 months after moving into the house, I had another baby. I connected with a lot of different people, friends, mothers with children with various needs, and I had heard different stories and different symptoms, and my daughter had stridor when she was born, and I was like, okay, this is a laryngomalacia baby. I know from my friends this is a laryngomalacia baby. And I made an ENT appointment for her. I actually called 2 different ENTs. I almost feel like she's his guardian angel in a way, because I made an appointment with 2 different ENTs for her, and I ended up taking her to see the one to the appointment that was sooner. And I never canceled the later appointment at the other specialist. And the day of that appointment, I was like, you know what? Like, I never canceled it. I feel bad. I don't want them to, like, charge me for canceling last minute. I might as well bring this other kid that everyone dismisses. Like, what's the worst case? They tell me, like, he has nothing. Okay, they made money. Like, I don't have to feel, like, I don't have to feel guilty.
Sure.
So I brought him, and I explained all of his symptoms, and the doctor said, I want to send him for a modified barium swallow study. Now, this is something I'd never heard of before. I think in the hospital, they, like, mentioned it in passing, but there was so much going on that, like, it never happened, and it was, like, from long ago. It was not something. So I took him, and I was so nervous that when I took him, that they were going to, like, not find anything. I have this fear of being the boy who cried wolf. And I remember sitting in on the modified barium swallow study. Like, you could sit, like, you could see them doing it. And they sat him in, like, a special, like a buckled chair. And they gave him different types of foods and then liquids. And I could see the x-ray. So first, he also has some sort of issue where he's low tone in his mouth, so he doesn't chew properly, which added insult to injury, because if you're not chewing and you're swallowing and you're, like, have a predisposition to choking, so then you're choking on whole chunks, it was very complicated. So at first they gave him I don't remember if it was first or last, but at a certain point they gave him an animal cracker, and he swallowed it basically whole. And it reminds me of like I don't know, like National Geographic, when you see, like, snakes swallowing eggs. Like, it was like you could see it going down his throat. And then I didn't know how to. I mean, I'm not a radiologist. I didn't know how to understand, like, aspiration. Like, I wouldn't have known how to notice that. But the results were, after they did the liquids, that, like, they said aspiration without penetration, I think is what they said. Like, it's going down the wrong pipe, but it's not going down all the way down the wrong pipe. Like, it's not entering the lungs.
Sure.
I felt extremely validated by these results. And ultimately, the doctor said he thinks that he may have a laryngeal cleft. But the problem was, he explained to me that the only way to know for certain if a child has laryngeal cleft is to go in there and look at it. It's not something that you can easily scope for. And at the time that and the child would have to be sedated. So at the point that you're sedating them, you might as well repair it at the same time.
Sure.
He said, though, that swallow therapy may be helpful.
Okay.
So I didn't want to I felt like my son had been through so much already. Didn't want to jump to the conclusion of surgery. So we did do swallow therapy, and nothing, and it didn't help. In the meantime, my daughter's issues persisted, and I was referred to the chief of swallow, who's a colleague of the first doctor who we saw, and I decided to go for a second opinion. And ultimately, the chief of swallow found more problems, whereas the first doctor had speculated that there were problems. I felt like he opened the door, but it was like a step in the right direction, but it was ultimately the chief of swallow of that hospital who was able to really pick up on all the issues. So whereas the first doctor was speculating that there may be something, and I was, I guess, ill at ease with that. Like, we're speculating, we're not really sure, so why should we do surgery? This doctor scoped him in the office, not as far down as you would see a laryngeal cleft, but he said, he has laryngeal malacia, which in and of itself could cause issues swallowing. And I think he probably has laryngeal cleft, and he had some other issues. He needed tubes, he had an adenoidectomy. So at the point that we were going to be correcting all these other things, I had less of an issue sending him to surgery.
Okay.
So.
Wow, that's a lot to go through.
Well, we didn't even know for sure if he had these things until he was in the operating room. So when we went to surgery for him, we were told he's for sure having adenoids. He may have tubes in his ears, and then they're going to scope further down, and they're going to see, they're going to correct the laryngeal malacia that they think is there, but they'll confirm it when they're in there, and then they'll scope further down and confirm whether or not there is a laryngeal cleft. Interestingly enough, we were in the waiting room outside of the OR for about 2 hours, and we didn't know we had signed consent for all of these different procedures just in case, so as to not hold up the OR. And when the doctor walked out, we like looked at him excitedly, so what did you find? Like, what happened? Like, did he end up having tubes? Did he end up just having an adenoidectomy? Does an adenoidectomy take 2 hours? Like, what? Right. Like, we were like waiting with bated breath. He's like, I'll never forget, because I thought it was kind of like, it was just like funny, like, oh, like we found everything, like, you know, like buy one, get one free, like buy one, get 3 free. Like, he needed the adenoids out. They were really big. He needed tubes. His ears were filled with thick fluid. And then he definitely had laryngomalacia. And then he took pictures of it while he was in there. He showed me, he's like, he had a classic laryngeal cleft type 1. Apparently it's not so common to have a laryngeal cleft. I'm sure in the circles of this podcast, it's very common.
Sure, yep.
But in the general population,
right.
It's not so common. And all of the residents who were attending the surgery started like clapping in the OR, because it's something that they were taught about, but that they seldom get to actually see. So everyone was so excited that like this thing that they learned about, but that they never got to correct and do, was there in front of them, and it presented them the opportunity to have hands-on learning. And ultimately our doctor chose I would say less invasive. There are different ways of treating it. He chose a less invasive way of treating it. We went a few steps back before we went a few steps forward. My son's healing journey was a little bit complicated because he was so sore. He refused to swallow, and he wasn't allowed to leave the hospital until he was able to swallow. Sure. But ultimately, finally, we got him to swallow, and slowly he was able to eat and swallow more and more and more. And now I can tell you that he does still choke, but it's much further and fewer between. And it's so nice. And yes, I still walk around with like a G-choker, and I still watch him. But I definitely feel like maybe I could like be 2 rooms over listening instead of 1 room over. Nice. So,
well, good. I'm glad to hear the success.
My whole story, basically.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. What was your support system like during all of this?
What was my support system like during all of this? It's interesting. I'm a very private person. I don't like to share, I guess, my problems. I'm much more willing to share happy things that are going on. It's very hard to seek support. Although in hindsight, I really could have used it. It was hard to seek support because there was nothing confirmed. So there was speculation that he had a laryngeal cleft. And there was a speculation that he had laryngomalacia, but because there was nothing specific, I didn't like post on Facebook. Like, my son is having laryngeal cleft, like a cleft repair today, because I didn't know if he was for sure having it. I didn't even know it till after the fact. I have a mother who lives down the block who has Heimlich many, many children before, so she's always like on call.
Okay.
But it's hard because I feel like this issue is something that's like kind of like what I said before. Like, it's hard to not see a child who's sick. It's hard to not see a child like this as sick, but they're not technically sick. There's just something, in his case, there was something anatomically wrong that tended to cause complications.
Right.
So it's not like he, God forbid, always had fever or was always on an IV, or he was like otherwise normal, and then all of a sudden something would happen. I just want to share, in case this is helpful to anybody, I had shared earlier that my son had these like mysterious coughing bouts. So we got a great explanation, and I don't know if this will be helpful for anybody else, but when a child has a laryngeal cleft, it's hard for them to control where the liquid is going. It could go down the wrong pipe very easily because there's literally a hole or a line or a cleft in the larynx. So it doesn't happen. These choking episodes don't just happen with drinks. When he used to be very congested, so he would choke on his own saliva or phlegm. So he would just be sitting there and he would just swallow his own secretions incorrectly, and that's what would cause these surprise choking episodes that, again, like, were not brought about by eating or by like running around. That made it hard for us once we knew that to like let him sleep in his own room, especially when he had a cold, because he would have these coughing bouts in the middle of the night from time to time. So we have like a baby camera in his room, and we again, like, we didn't keep him in our room because of that, but we've put up a lot of safeguards to make sure that, like, if anything happens, we, like, come running right away. And it's happened, and thank God it hasn't happened since the surgery. So
Good. What's been the most helpful thing for you during this whole journey? If you think back and reflect, I'm really glad this was part of our journey, or this was really helpful to me during this experience.
Well, I look back, this is probably not the answer that you're looking for, but I do look back at, like, birth of my daughter as kind of like an obvious blessing for many reasons. But the fact that she presented with this, like, benign stridor, which ended up being laryngomalacia that she grew on time, like, I feel like it was, like, almost like God giving us a wink. Like, it was like she was like a little messenger who helped guide us to the right people. And if I wouldn't have made those appointments for her, and if she wouldn't have had some feeding issues in the beginning, I wouldn't necessarily have pursued all these very specialized specialists who were able to say, oh, like, I would bring her, and then I would say, by the way, I have a son who has this and this and this. Like, oh, it sounds like he could use XYZ. So then that was like a clue in the next direction. So that's been very helpful. I would say connecting online, although I wish that I had found some of the resources that I now know of sooner.
Sure.
I had joined special needs moms Facebook groups, but they're so varied. There are so many different types of issues in those groups, and everyone offers a lot of different insight. But ultimately, like I said, like, my son was like treated for croup so many times when it wasn't croup. He didn't need a nebulizer. There was like a congenital defect of the airway, and that needed to be repaired.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, well, I'm glad that your daughter kind of helped guide the path for getting more answers for your son, and that he's doing so well now. That's fantastic. I'm glad you were able to find some resources to help you along your journey, even if they weren't the most timely. There are several out there. I'll mention a few just in case somebody's listening to this that isn't familiar with some of them. The NFOSD has a pediatric Facebook support group that has, I think, over 2,000 parents and caregivers that are active on that, whose children have, a wide range of difficulty with feeding and swallowing caused by all different things. The foundation had previously hosted a virtual monthly meeting that's on pause for the summer, but I think we'll resume that in the fall. And then we also have a medical advisory board if there's parents out there that, parents know their children the best. And so you're the biggest advocate for your children. And if the doctors are saying, I don't think there's anything wrong, but you feel differently, keep advocating for them. We have a medical advisory board that can help guide you as to who you should contact. Our organization doesn't give any medical advice to you, but we can help guide you on your journey to say, this type of specialist might be beneficial to see. So those are a couple of resources. Another organization called Feeding Matters is great for little ones that are having trouble with feeding and swallowing. They have a peer-to-peer support network too, where they'll connect you with another parent who's been on a similar journey, who's farther ahead in their journey, who can help give some guidance and reflection on what it's like to manage and navigate those waters. So, Rebecca, thank you so much. Is there anything else you would like to share with us?
No. I'll share one thing. After they scoped him, this is just like the punchline, they were able to confirm that he had inflammation all the way down to his lungs. So even though they had said that it was, I forget if it's aspiration without penetration or penetration without aspiration, but that it was going down the wrong pipe, but not all the way. When a little tiny drop of water hits a stone for so many years, ultimately it can leave a mark. And so even though in the modified barium swallow study, it was seemingly like a red flag that wasn't extremely worrisome, ultimately, like, it did cause chronic inflammation of his airways, and that explained a whole host of other issues that we saw. So I just feel extremely blessed to have found the doctor that we found and to have gotten to the bottom of it, and then that led me down like another rabbit hole. But it's great because now I'm starting finally for the first time in 3.5 years to have answers. So like you said, if you don't like one ENT or if you don't like one swallow specialist, that's okay. Keep trying, because hopefully you'll find somebody who's great, and hopefully someone will think out of the box and find the solution for you.
Yep. So. Yeah, kudos to you for advocating for so long. 3 years is a long time to be pushing for answers, and knowing is so often better than not knowing, even if what you know turns out to be a challenging diagnosis. But in your case, I'm so glad you were able to get the help that your son needed. Thank you. I know you had mentioned earlier that you're not one for sharing, so we appreciate you sharing your story with us. It's so helpful, and I'm sure this will help many others that are going through similar experiences as you are. So we appreciate your time. Thanks for sharing with us, and reach out anytime.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy that we connected.